Good afternoon and welcome to the 2013-14 Bannon Institute, What Good is God? My name is Mick McCarthy and I'm the Executive Director of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education here at Santa Clara University. The Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education is charged with promoting and enhancing the distinctively Jesuit Catholic tradition of education at Santa Clara. And our vision is to be recognized in Silicon Valley and beyond as providing leadership for the integration of faith, justice, and the intellectual life. A major effort in achieving our vision and mission are the annual Bannon Institutes, which provide for the university a range of events that address matters of significance to the Jesuit Catholic intellectual tradition, foster an ethic of dialogue among persons of diverse religious and philosophical commitments, and offer opportunities for exchange across the university and broader community. This year's Bannon Institute, What Good is God?, poses a question that has always been a concern of theology and philosophy, but in our times it has an added significance. Christian theologians, for instance, have long asked the question, what do we mean when we assert that God is good? What kind of good might we understand God to be? What good is God? More and more, however, we may ask the question with a different intention. We may also ask about God, well, what's the use? In an age that can rightly celebrate human achievement apart from any religious framework, why God? What good is God? However one might approach that question, it is a question of enormous consequence and worthy of the intellectual energy of Santa Clara University. Moreover, it is a question that the Jesuit University of Silicon Valley is uniquely poised to ask. And we're delighted to begin this year's Bannon Institute with an extremely distinguished international scholar. And to introduce him, I will call upon Professor John Hawley, Chair of Santa Clara's Department of English.
Thank you, Father McCarthy. I had the pleasure of having lunch with our speaker today and sadly learned that he had been diagnosed with a disease that some of us at the table hoped was contagious, called hypergraphia, which is the inability to stop writing. So I should begin by acknowledging, with shame, that the library in which we are listening to Professor Eagleton today has acquired only 26 of his books. We surely have an order in for the other 14 or so. Professor Eagleton worried that he didn't yet have a book scheduled for release in 2020. All the other years seem to be covered. Despite this erudition, Sir Christopher Ricks, who had been professor of poetry at Oxford, once described him as a stand-up comic. Indeed, as we learned at lunch, he can be both at once. And he's a good singer, which he may demonstrate today with enough encouragement as he did at lunch. In his review of a book by Gayatri Spivak, the high priestess of post-colonial theory, Eagleton is in good form, writing that there must exist somewhere a secret handbook for post-colonial critics, the first rule of which reads, begin by rejecting the whole notion of post-colonialism. It is remarkable how hard it is to find an unabashed enthusiast for the concept among those who promote it, as hard as it was in the 60s or 70s to find anyone who owned up to being a structuralist. The idea of the post-colonial has taken such a battering from post-colonial theorists that to use the word unreservedly of oneself would be rather like calling oneself fatso or confessing to a furtive interest in coprophilia. Nothing is more voguish in guilt-ridden U.S. academia than to point to the inevitable bad faith of one's position. It is the nearest a postmodernist can come to authenticity. The second rule of the Samizdat handbook reads, be as obscurantist as you can decently get away with. Obscurantist is definitely one thing that Terry Eagleton is not. His great gift among many is clarity. In his 2009 book, Reason, Faith, and Revolution, he creates a figure called Ditchkins, a combination of atheists Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, and writes that in a world in which theology is increasingly part of the problem, as Ditchkin rightly considers it, it is also fostering the kind of critical reflection which might contribute to some of the answers. There are lessons which the secular left can learn from religion, for all its atrocities and absurdities, and the left is not so flush with ideas that it can afford to look such a gift horse in the mouth. There are those like Ditchkins who hold that if we can only shake off a poisonous legacy of myth and superstition, we can be free. This, in my own view, is itself a myth, though a generous-spirited one. Terry Eagleton was educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, and on graduating became a Fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, the youngest fellow since the 18th century. He has been a Fellow of 4 Oxford and Cambridge colleges, as well as Thomas Warton Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford. He has also been John Edward Taylor Professor of English Literature at the University of Manchester and Distinguished Visiting Professor at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and is currently Distinguished Visiting Professor in English at the Universities of Lancaster and Notre Dame. His works have been translated into 30 or so languages. He is an Honorary Fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge, a Fellow of the British Academy, a Fellow of the English Association, and the holder of 9 Honorary Doctorates of Letters. Apparently, a good fellow all around. Acclaimed by many as the greatest living British literary critic, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Terry Eagleton.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Can you hear that at the back? Is that all right? Yes. And very grateful to the Ignatian Center for inviting me. I'm told this is the oldest university in the United States, and in California. And as one who has spent some 30 years teaching in Oxford, I'm always delighted to see these new institutions springing up all around us, taking your first toddler-like steps towards the future. I'm sure you have teething troubles at the moment, but do rest assured, that you will sail into a glorious future from this probationary beginning. And with those odiously paternalist words, I will now turn to my paper. The difference between theologians, I think, and old-fashioned 19th century rationalists like Richard Dawkins is that when Dawkins holds forth on God, he doesn't know what he's talking about, but doesn't know that he doesn't, whereas when theologians talk about God, they don't really know what they're talking about, but know that they don't. The difference, in short, between unknown unknowns and known unknowns, as that towering intellectual figure of our time, Donald Rumsfeld, would have put it. For the greatest, I suppose, the greatest post-ancient theologian who ever lived, Thomas Aquinas, all talk about God is fuzzy, nebulous, analogous, metaphorical, hit and miss, blurred at the edges, and in the end, so much garbage. Useful garbage, perhaps, like a couple of dollar bills you might find in the trash can, but garbage nonetheless, which of course is why Aquinas was finally to describe his own mighty Summa, perhaps the greatest work of theology ever written, as so much straw, and lay down his pen after producing about the equivalent, I think, of 2 or 3 novels a month in writing it, and fall silent for the few years or months remaining to him. As St. Augustine puts it in the Confessions, there's really not much point in talking about God, but that's no excuse for keeping your mouth shut either. Although he said it rather more elegantly and also in Latin, which is even more admirable. And since in any case, I suppose God is the source of talk about himself, then he logically transcends it. We talk, don't we, about going to the horse's mouth for the real story, but the irony of that is that horses don't speak, and neither does God, except perhaps through people like Thomas and Augustine. In fact, don't let this go beyond these four walls, but there are all kinds of things that God can't do, despite popular reports of his omniscience or omnipotence. He can't shave his legs, for example, because he doesn't have any. He can't fasten his shoelaces, prefer Burgundy to Madeira. No logically contradictory things like a square triangle, a right-wing bottle of scotch, an exquisitely cultivated member of the Tea Party, and other such oxymorons. Moron perhaps being the word in some certain cases. My own favourite example of an oxymoron being business ethics. Neither, for that matter, can God know what's going to happen next Wednesday at 3:17 p.m. Because there's no such thing as what's going to happen next Wednesday at 3:17 p.m. in the sense of what's bound to happen. If God knows the world, then he must know it in its openness and autonomy and contingency. He can know what will contingently happen next Wednesday at 3:17, but that's a different matter. It's not even clear that God is able to be good. For one thing, not many theologians worth their salt these days, I suppose, would claim that God was a moral being. God isn't any kind of moral. Being morality is for creatures like us who don't know how to be happy, who don't know what we really desire, and therefore who have to engage in interminable conversations about it, called things like ethics and politics. God is luckily released from all that. In fact, he isn't, of course, a being at all in the sense of a determinate entity within the universe. He isn't any kind of entity. He's neither within the universe nor outside it, and he isn't an object, phenomenon, principle, or even a person in the sense in which Al Gore is arguably a person. So I think all good theologians then can surely agree with Dawkins and Dennett and the rest of that crew that God doesn't exist. He isn't any kind of existent entity. He's the reason why there are any existent entities at all, rather than just nothing. He can't be reckoned up with other things. God and the universe don't make two. Whatever other mistakes believers might make, and they make quite a few, not being able to count isn't one of them. Thinking that there's one more object in the universe than there actually is not the kind of mistake that believers make, whatever other errors and crimes they may commit. So I'm afraid that what elsewhere I've called the Bigfoot theory of faith, in a remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive book entitled Reason, Faith and Revolution, written all by myself. I'm afraid that idea, what I call there the Yeti or the Bigfoot idea of faith, will have to go. You know, the idea that God is a rather mysterious creature, like the Yeti or Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster, whatever you have, as to whose existence the evidence is currently ambiguous and indeterminate, so that some people believe he exists while other people don't. Suffice it to say, as I'm sure you're aware, this has very little indeed to do with the Christian notion of faith. Abraham had faith in God, but given his historical circumstances, he wouldn't have been able, presumably, to imagine that God didn't exist. But he had faith in him, nevertheless. The devils are said to believe in the existence of God, but they don't have faith in him. For me to have faith in you is not for me to subscribe to the proposition that you exist. For another thing, the word good, as Father McCarthy indicated, can be used of God only analogously or metaphorically. When we call him good, we don't really know what we're talking about. He certainly isn't good in the sense that he doesn't commit adultery, doesn't say things like, "Oh Christ," and always eats his 5 portions of vegetables a day. To say that he doesn't commit adultery isn't, of course, to say that he's chaste, just as to say that he doesn't curse isn't to say that he's impeccably, verbally well-behaved. It's rather to say this whole sort of language is simply no more applicable to God than it is to a badger or a baseball bat. God isn't a moral being, though he's the source of morality in others, which is to say he's the source of an ecstatic, overflowing abundance of life. Morality, of course, having to do, in the first place, not with duty, obligation, responsibility, self-discipline, self-repression, and all those other rather grim-faced puritanical notions, but with human fulfillment. What do human beings desire? How are they to know it? And how are they together to fulfill it? Duties, obligations, responsibilities may indeed, all that Kantian talk, may indeed have its place, but it has to find a place within that broader and deeper context of what is it, what does it take to be happy. Morality, of course, is really all about learning how to live fully, enjoyably, and superabundantly, whereas evil is a deficiency or defectiveness of life. Those who have never really got the hang of being human, a sort of zombie-like condition, an incapacity to be fully alive, an apparent, a kind of simulated life, to be sure, rather like a vampire, but not genuine life. But because we are, of course, desperately opaque and impenetrable to ourselves, sometimes a lot more so than we are to each other, knowing how to enjoy and fulfill ourselves is by no means an easy matter. We can't just look into our hearts and see in some sentimental, intuitionist kind of way. So we need to evolve certain specialized ways of talking, known as moral philosophy or political theory or whatever it is, which might help us out. Even then, the discussion of what it is to live well, what it is to be fulfilled and contented, what the good life consists in, will never come to an end any more than the interpretation of King Lear will ever come to an end. Almost everybody agrees, for example, I take it, that torturing small babies is not the most morally resplendent form of behavior, unless they've been very naughty. But the curious thing, of course, is we can't agree on why we agree on that. And we probably never will. Yes? Some Christians, for example, appeal to the New Testament, so-called, I suppose an anti-Semitic phrase, really, but let it pass, to defend their views on sexual morality. Some Christians think morality is sexual morality, but the gospel has in fact, of course, exceedingly little to say about sex, and what little it does have to say is remarkably laid back about it, as with Jesus and the woman of Samaria. Jesus, who, as we know, hung out with at least one whore, isn't only forgiving of the Samaritan woman, the very fact that he should speak to a woman alone, without his minders being around, let alone a woman with such a colourful sexual history, would have seemed scandalous to the pious Jews of the time. Even worse, to speak to a low form of life like a Samaritan, as the Jews of the time regarded them, is even perhaps more outrageous. What we can be sure of, I think, in that department of things is that almost all of the Gospel's references to that revered Western institution, the family, are caustic, critical, and resoundingly negative. New Testament has very little time for the family indeed, no doubt the horror of American advertisers everywhere. That morality is about pleasurable fulfillment is the good news. The bad news is that if you're going to take that seriously, you're very likely to end up getting yourself crucified. Pleasurable fulfillment for everybody involves issues of justice. Issues of justice involve questions of conflict, and questions of conflict can well involve death. The message of the gospel is stark, simple, and utterly devastating. If you don't love, you're dead, and if you do, they'll kill you. There's your pie in the sky. There's your opium of the people for you. There are your consolations of religion. At the centre of Christianity is the tortured, reviled figure of a suspected political rebel who spoke up for love and justice and was murdered by the state for his pains. I say political rebel because, of course, the Romans reserved crucifixion almost entirely for political offences. The idea was to pin somebody up and say, this is what you'll get if you try to revolt against the empire as well, or at least for those individuals whom it suited them to pretend were political rebels, which was perhaps the case with Jesus. It's doubtful they really thought he was, because I suppose if they had done, they would almost certainly have moved in on his comrades straight away after his death, which apparently they didn't. The logo above Jesus' cross, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, is of course a wonderful example of pure bathos. Not in this case from the sublime to the ridiculous, but from the ridiculous to the sublime. Nazareth means a pretty kind of rural backwater sort of place, So Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, would be a bit like, Bob of Gary, Indiana, President of the Universe. Yes, yeah. It's a darkly mocking and satirical text, on the behalf of these particular rulers. Nonetheless, even though they didn't move in on his comrades after his death, and they probably didn't think he was a political rebel, they perhaps believed that he might spark an insurrection at a very tinderbox-like moment at the Passover, and no doubt the Jewish ruling class managed to persuade them somehow that he was a political threat. They wouldn't. The Romans, of course, would not have taken the least interest in whether Jesus claimed to be the Son of God or not. For a start, he only ambiguously claims that anyway. Secondly, it's not necessarily a very dramatic claim. All Jews were sons and daughters of God. Israel, as a whole, was the son of God. And in any case, the Romans didn't give a damn about the theological squabbles of their colonial peoples. They were only concerned if they looked like issuing in political rebellion, which perhaps the Sanhedrin, who knows, managed to persuade them did. The so-called thieves pinned up on either side of Jesus were probably, I suppose, zealots, members of the revolutionary anti-Roman underground guerrilla movement, the Palestinian IRA, as it were, of the day, as possibly were some of Jesus's immediate comrades. In fact, one is actually called a zealot. To a casual bystander, I suppose, quite a lot of what he said might have sounded like good zealot stuff, even if it wasn't. In real life, of course, Pontius Pilate was nothing like the bemused, metaphysically minded liberal that the gospel presents him as. He was a ruthless killer who crucified rebels at the drop of a hat and was finally dishonorably dismissed from the imperial service. And you had to be pretty dishonorable to be dismissed from the Roman service. The gospel writers, of course, have a political and theological agenda here, which dictates that when it comes to responsibility for the state murder of Jesus, they should be nice to the Romans and nasty to the Jews. The idea that the Messiah could be killed would, of course, struck the Jews of his time as an unspeakable moral obscenity. The Messiah was the heroic figure, not necessarily a priestly figure, but the heroic figure to lead the Jews into salvation, lead the Jews into political liberation. The idea, and Jesus as it were, an anti-Messiah, as one who ends up strung up, as one who enters the national capital on the back of a donkey, is full of satirical gestures about the nature of that conception of power. He sees that any enduring power has to have its root in weakness, to have a kind of secret compact with weakness, otherwise it simply won't endure. Incidentally, and I once got into terrible trouble when I said this on BBC Radio, so please don't throw anything at me or make sure it's dollar bills or something of the kind. Or, of course, if he really did only spend a few hours on the cross, he was amazingly lucky. Yeah? I mean, most people who were crucified thrashed around for days. Maybe it was the loss of blood that helped him on his way. If you're going to be crucified, make sure they scourge you first, because it makes it all rather quicker. Even so, he had, for the crucifixion to be really tragic, which I think it was, and I don't mean by tragic here just, very sad, and nor do I mean necessarily without a good outcome, but for it to be really tragic, he had to live his death to the full. For his death to turn, as with ourselves, for his death to turn from a cul-de-sac to a horizon, he had to take it with absolute seriousness, and no doubt with utter bewilderment, as the last word. Only if one takes it as absolutely the last word, in all of its reality, might it just turn out not to be. To regard it as some kind of springboard into eternity is, of course, exactly the non-tragic, false, phony version of that. If Jesus had thought to himself, well, only a few hours up here, then 3 days in the tomb, and then off to paradise, I'm up for that. Sounds all right, He, of course, most certainly would not have been raised from the dead. Yes. Back to the question of, is God good? What good is God? Traditionally, good is a functional term, isn't it? I mean, a good clock is one that keeps time, and a good knife is one that can cut. But what function does God have? To create the universe, perhaps? To get things off the ground? Well, the doctrine of creation, of course, has nothing whatsoever with how things got off the ground, whatever theological illiterates like Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett may think. Thomas Aquinas believed in the doctrine of creation, but thought it perfectly possible that the universe had no beginning, as indeed his great mentor Aristotle believed. He didn't actually believe that because of the first book of Genesis, but he thought it was perfectly possible. It wasn't in any sense for him violating the doctrine of creation to believe that creation never had a beginning, because it simply wasn't for him about that. If you want to know what the doctrine is really about, then if you just approach me privately afterwards, then for a very modest fee, I will let you know about it. So God has no function in that sense. It's not as though we needed somebody to kick the thing off and get the thing started. In fact, he doesn't have a function in any sense. He's completely useless. And that, of course, is the most precious thing about him. He's his own grounds, reasons, ends, foundations, raison d'être, with absolutely no purpose beyond himself. He is, in fact, the supremely autonomous being. The word autonomous, of course, literally meaning a law unto himself. He's his own law. If atheist and theologian can agree on one proposition at least, it's surely that there's no point to God whatsoever. What is he good for? Nothing. If we can speak of him as good, which is questionable, he's good for nothing. He's good for no reason, benefit, gain, practical advantage, instrumental end, simply good for entirely, purely and entirely for its own sake, or to adopt a more technical theological term, good just for the hell of it. Like all the finest things in existence, collecting insanely expensive porcelain vases, drinking yourself under the table, reading Marcel Proust, and so on. God exists for his own endless and eternal self-delight, a self-delight which is, however, contagious, which spills over endlessly, like a self-replenishing fountain, and communicates itself to others in what we know as grace. So that these others too, meaning us, can also try to live in the same way, to live, if you like, non-instrumentally or non-teleologically, all this strange talk of life as a journey, I don't see my life as a journey at all. At least I lost the map quite a long time ago, if it is. So that people, human beings, can, where they most resemble God, is precisely in being pretty useless as well. That's to say, in living, in realizing their energies and capacities purely for their own sake. Which is to say, paradoxically, that where we belong most to God is where we're most autonomous. Yes, where we're most self-determining. That's where we belong to him most. Our dependency on him is the very ground and source of our freedom, not the dependency of a servant or a slave on a master. Rather, as one's dependency on good parents will become, in the fullness of time, if we're lucky, the source and ground of our own free flourishing. There's no freedom without a prior, deeper and more radical dependency, a fact which American society, with its idolatrous cult of the self-determining individual, rather disastrously fails to realize. In fact, I say, if we're lucky, we will flourish autonomously, but of course nobody really is entirely lucky in that respect, as Freud points out. We all have to live through a catastrophe known as infancy, which will continue to scar and maim us from the inside, and with which none of us will ever entirely come to terms. It's just a matter of degrees of botching. Certainly not by growing up to be mature sexual beings. Sexuality is where we're most infantile, not where we're most adult. But that's another story, even though it may be the only bit of this talk you remember in 2 weeks' time. There's a class of very rare entities which are all, to use the technical term, autotelic, having their end in themselves. The first member of this class I've just been talking about, namely God. But the same is true of art, or at least art as it becomes to be redefined in the modern period. Not a view of art, I think, that Aristotle or Plato would have understood, or Dante would have understood. In the early development of capitalist society, art begins to have less and less of a social function and becomes merely another commodity in the marketplace. And one response to this humiliation, what one might call the radical romantic response, is to pluck a virtue out of necessity by insisting that art's apparent pointlessness is precisely its point. The whole point of art is that it's gloriously pointless. Yes, there's a certain element of rationalization in this, to be sure. There's also a rather important insight. Art, in this conception, is a living critique, simply not by virtue of what it says or represents, simply by virtue of the strange, self-generative, autonomous kind of thing it is. It's a living critique of a corrupt and philistine social order for which anything that has no price and no utility can have no value. What's scandalous about art, what's even at times politically disruptive about it, is the fact that it simply keeps conjuring itself up mysteriously from its own unfathomable depths in a sort of look, no hands kind of way, purely for the sake of its own self-delight, faithful to no law or no logic that it doesn't fashion for itself, so that, ironically, it's in the very uselessness of these strange, beautiful works of art that their power as political critique actually lies. The enormous paradox of modernism, it's in the very autonomy of the work of art that it is, as it were, most politically eloquent. Almost all aesthetic terms, unity, autonomy, beauty, spirit, sublimity, self-determination, so on, almost all aesthetic terms are bits of displaced theology. And the work of art is now, in modernity, being called upon to step into the Almighty's shoes as an image of his own glorious uselessness on earth. There's a displacement, a shift in the 18th century from, certainly in the 19th century, from theology to aesthetics in this respect. So God first, the work of art second. Third item in this strange category of autotelic things is us, human beings, or rather, as human beings as we could be under transformed political conditions. Because for the radical romantics, we need to create a social order in which men and women can realize their capacities as far as possible for their own sake and for their own fulfillment, not for the power or profit of a few, a society which no longer would be dominated by exchange value or the commodity form or the sway of instrumental reason, for which nothing has value unless it has a point. And I think one might call this the politics of creation. Creation in the sense in which I've spoken about. It's therefore no surprise that the mightiest thinker in this lineage, Karl Marx, I thought you'd expect me to mention him at least once, so there it is. Quite harmless, really. I promise not to do it again. That for Marx, very interesting for Marx, the paradigm of production, when Marx comes to talk about production, paradigm for him is not coal mines or cotton mills, it's the work of art. Yes? Marx, of course, who was a staggeringly erudite intellectual in the great Central European tradition, for just that reason, because the work of art seemed to him to represent a form of production which was as far as possible self-fulfilling and an end in itself. Socialism for Marx is not, of course, about labour, it's about leisure, or leisure, as I believe you call it here. It's about finding some way, and there's a lot of debate about how you might do this and so on, finding some way of using the formidable material resources which capitalism, which Marx of course regarded as the most dynamic and revolutionary system humanity had ever known, and was lost in praise for it. If ever you want a paean of praise to capitalism, read the Communist Manifesto. To release that accumulated wealth as far as possible to free men and women from the more degrading forms of toil. Yes? So that, as far as possible, they might realize their powers and capacities for their own sake. And what form that would take, Marx famously, or notoriously, has almost nothing to say, because you can't pre-draft freedom. You can't pre-draft the future. For Marx, everything that has happened so far, he refuses even to dignify with the title of history. It's all prehistory, another tedious variant on the routines of exploitation and oppression, and the only historic event would be to somehow bring that to an end. The only image of the future for Marx is the failure of the present, and I think in that he's a true prophet in the great Judaic tradition, not a prophet, of course, in the debased sense of a clairvoyant. That's exactly what he isn't. He's not peering into a crystal ball. A prophet in the sense that of one who reminds people that if they don't change their ways, then there's not likely to be much of a future, or at least it's likely to be fairly unpleasant. Marx could never really overcome his astonishment that in the midst of the greatest accumulation of prosperity by far that history has ever witnessed, though men and women were still living lives of wretched, squalid, fruitless toil. So much so that the great German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, the gloomiest philosopher who ever lived, so gloomy he's unwittingly hilarious. I don't know why unremitting gloom is funny, but it is somehow, isn't it? A kind of tunnel vision type gloom. Schopenhauer thought it was astonishing that anybody could believe that the vast majority of men and women who had lived and died on the face of the earth would not have been better off dead. Today, in the midst of the greatest affluence that history has ever created, we actually work harder than our Neolithic ancestors. We actually happen to know how hard our Neolithic ancestors worked, and we work harder. And Americans work even harder than that, getting up at some unearthly hour in the morning. We, stay in bed until 10 or 11 in the morning, Oscar Wilde, who was a socialist as well as an aesthete, and the two were deeply connected in Wilde. Wilde, of course, wrote a pamphlet, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, that was very important in the British Labour movement. Wilde believed devoutly in what I'm calling here the politics of creation, which is to say that God made the world not as some kind of celestial manufacturer, but made it for fun, made it out of the sheer joy and love of it, as gift and grace and gratuity, so that the universe itself, as the French existentialists might say, is the original acte gratuit. The doctrine of creation means, I think, more or less that. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo means, among other things, that God didn't have to make the world. He doesn't have to do anything. That there's absolutely no necessity about anything whatsoever, least of all Mel Gibson and Sarah Palin. That everything that exists might just as easily not have done, that there could just as well have been nothing as well as something. That sort of area is what I think the doctrine of creation is about. Nothing has any right to exist at all, least of all us, and does so only by the love and graciousness of God, and every self-reflective thing or individual is perpetually overshadowed by the awareness of its own fragility and provisionality and precariousness, its lack of absolute foundations, its radical dependency in ourselves. That takes, among other things, the form of a fear of death. The modernist work of art, ironically aware of its own groundlessness, is one such phenomenon. Wilde understood all this in his own way, and he was a socialist for the very, very best of reasons. The two best reasons for being a socialist are, first of all to annoy people you don't really like, and secondly, because you don't like having to work. I have some membership cards at the back for anybody who needs to annoy somebody and who is deeply indolent. In Wilde's ideal future, not Marx's, but Wilde's, we would just lie around the place all day in various interesting postures of erotic gratification, wearing loose crimson garments, reading Homer to each other, and sipping absinthe. And that would just be the working day. You know, I won't begin to describe the leisure time. There is, in fact, a fourth member of the autotelic category, and that is evil, on which I also wrote a remarkably cheap and extraordinarily attractive book. I don't mean by evil something boring, like, very, very bad. Evil is a very special and gratifyingly very rare kind of badness, species of badness, in which, for example, you take an obscenely pleasurable relish in destruction just for the sake of it. Evil is radically non-utilitarian. It's a syndrome that lurks behind the Holocaust, one of the most mind-warping features of which, of course, is that there was absolutely no reason for it. I mean, there was a reason why Stalin or Mao slaughtered so many kulaks, or whoever he slaughtered, atrocious crimes, but done for some twisted, sense of utility. Not even that when it comes to the Holocaust. Indeed, of course, militarily speaking, the Holocaust was counterproductive, tied up men and personnel and resources that could well have been used for the war effort. It didn't even make sense in ideological terms. I mean, if you want to make a bogeyman out of Jews, you don't have to murder 6 million of them. There is an insane perfectionism about the Holocaust, a desire to wipe every offending piece of matter utterly out of existence, which is very typical of evil rather than just of being, very, very bad. The Iago complex, I suppose you might call it, this kind of malevolence, inexplicable malevolence, but there are lots of other literary examples as well. I suppose the finest example of an evil figure in literature in the 20th century being Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus. So the evil are on term, because the evil is radically autotelic, is non-utilitarian, the evil are on terms with the good. The evil like to see themselves in a kind of superior way as, sort of on the same level as the saints, superior to us mere moral middle classes, so to speak. The saints are, of course, those, to go back to what I was saying before about being good, being human, something you have to get good at. The saints are those who are virtuosi of being human, the Pavarottis or Tiger Woods of being human, and that's the only sentence in which Tiger Woods and good have been mentioned at the same time. the evil are intolerably elitist. Think of the doomed Pinky in Graham Greene's Brighton Rock, or William Golders' Pincher Martin. Now, I think Martin is actually in purgatory rather than in hell. Like Pinky, evil is monkish, ascetic, life-denying, absolutely solitary, disgusted with existence, nauseated by human contact, as Hitler was, incidentally, virulently hostile to materiality, to the body, unable to concede the blessedness of materiality, infinitely arrogant, leeching for its identity on its own non-being, and unable to contain its yelps of sniggering, incredulous, buffoonish laughter at the mere idea that human meanings and values could be anything but utterly bogus. Evil doesn't exist for anything, and neither does good. Both are good for nothing, mirror images of one another, so it makes a kind of sense that the devil was once an angel. Evil regards the creation as a calamitous blunder on the part of a well-meaning but lamentably short-sighted deity, and wants to return as soon as possible to a condition pure, unblemished, beautiful, terrifying, in which there is absolutely nothing, not a single contaminating particle of matter. To scramble back to that state, it's prepared to annihilate the whole of creation, like the mad professor in Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent. Or at least, if not that, then, as a piece of graffiti around in my student days used to put it, it wants a situation in which God is alive and well and working on a much less ambitious project. Are human beings good for nothing, then? Well, according to the so-called New Testament, I think they ought to be. They should be good, but for nothing, for no reason, gain, self-advantage, no return. Henry Fielding remarks in the course of Tom Jones that there is, he says, a doctrine, an honourable and venerable doctrine, that the good shall receive their reward in this world. A doctrine, he says, which has only one defect, namely, it is not true. They're much more likely to end up hanged. There is, of course, a place where the good do receive their reward in this world and the evil are packed off, but it's known as the novel, the modern form of providence. And Fielding, of course, as a magistrate, was ironically aware of the fact. Yes, the good will receive their comeuppance, their reward in the novel, but it's pretty clear that they will get precious little outside it. Not only, the New Testament is in a sense quite a mad, sort of surreal, almost sort of Dadaist doctrine. Not only should one expect no return, but one should give more than requested. You know, walk 2 miles rather than 1, give you a cloak as well as your coat, and so on. These are deliberately surreal, extravagant, over-the-top gestures, which are intended to make a mockery of exchange value, of tit for tat, of the strict equivalences of the capitalist bookkeepers or the accountancy-minded Judas, whose surname, by the way, might just link him to the Zealots. It's an eschatological ethics, one which suggests that there's no time for revenge, calculation, exact returns, tit for tat, and so on, because the kingdom of God is almost upon us. Jesus himself, of course, may well have believed that. 1 or 2 of his remarks suggest that he did think that, and St. Paul certainly did. But though humanity's time isn't quite up, mine is. So there I'll end. Thank you very much. So we have some time for comments, questions, strident enunciations. There's also a microphone over there.
I have a Hungarian background, so maybe that's why I'm willing to ask a question. Somehow or other, the relationship between infinity and time has always kind of fascinated me. So this is a terrible question to ask, but have you any words about that relationship, which I think is kind of at the heart of we're stuck in time and God is, can't say in infinity, infinite.
One thing that always strikes me as an outsider here in this country is the what one might call the cult of infinity. Yes, desire, ambition, reaching, striving are infinite. You can always do more, go one further, go better. Yes, reach for the sky and so on. And it's accompanied by a curious cult of voluntarism, cult of the will. If you don't succeed in doing that, you simply have to try harder. Yes, you can crack it if you try. Keep trying. It seems to me pernicious nonsense and very, very dangerous, because it ignores, it sweeps grandly aside the finite nature of human beings, the creaturely nature of human beings. If you dangle such grandiose ideals before them, all you'll succeed in doing is rub their noses in their inability to achieve them. That's what St. Paul, one of the things St. Paul thinks is wrong with the law, isn't it? I mean, he's very ambivalent about the law, but the law, quite apart from only telling you where you went wrong and not encouraging you to go right, the law holds out, like the Freudian superego, holds out ideals that it should know the poor, bruised and battered ego is not capable of achieving. The superego for Freud is not only tyrannical, but stupid. It's obtuse. It should know that we can't meet these high and mighty demands. The literature of finitude, in a certain sense, is comedy, isn't it? Comedy finds funny, in fact, frailty and finitude and not achieving these grand ideals. So it maintains a kind of a compact with weakness and with fallibility, yes. And it sees that any enduring value can only be built on that basis, yes. Whereas, you see, I think that one of the saddest aspects of 9/11 was that it was a tragedy happening in a nation which is deeply anti-tragic, which is, in its common wisdom, upbeat, affirmative, square-jawed, look to tomorrow, yeah? And that is you are least well equipped then to handle an awful tragedy like that. Contrast that with a Europe that is buried under a tragic history, yes, where the rubbles and ruins of that strew the moral and human landscape. One of the unsettling things about desire, and of course desire is not in the least pleasant, one of the unsettling things about desire is its ruthless infinity. It insists on more, and therefore it lacks the concept of hubris. The ancient Greeks knew very well, didn't they, that you had to move very carefully in a world in which everything is subtly interconnected with everything else, and you might at any moment just put your foot on some force that then triggers some catastrophe. Yes, you had to. In other words, piety and reverence were necessary virtues. And I think part of the point of tragedy is to recall us, whip us back almost to that sense of precariousness and fragility on which any sense of value depends. The great opponent of this kind of mad idealism is, of course, Samuel Beckett. Beckett's drama is the drama of solidarity with failure, and not in the least accidental, in my view, that Beckett was Irish. A long tradition. One reason why there's so much comedy comes out of Ireland is, in the end, the only way you can deal with such a wretched history is to laugh at it. Humour is one way of keeping your head above water, so to speak. Yes, but Beckett even refuses. I mean, you might say that it's arguable, it's controversial, that Beckett's characters are not even capable of aspiring to the status of tragedy. They can't even hang themselves. They can't even muster enough resources, to hang themselves from a tree. and that, and of course, what does that illustrate? The consistent Irish trope all the way throughout Irish culture of bathos and debunkery. The Irish have only to see an ideal to want to deflate it straight away. And that's what you do in small societies, because you know people too well to think that they can, and I think that's very therapeutic. I think that is really very therapeutic. And I think, actually, if I may say so, I think the United States could learn something from that.
Thank you for the talk. Since you believe that God is not an existent, let alone an anthropomorphic one, why do you use the word he rather than it, or let's say even she?
Or they, perhaps. No reason at all. No reason at all. Not, of course, because God is a woman, any more than he, she is a man, but because gender is part of our condition, not part of his, hers. It's theirs. Yes. So I don't. There's nothing greatly at stake for me in that, in this sense, that I think I could rewrite that paper saying she or it. I mean, God defeats our pronouns and adjectives and so on. You're absolutely right. Yes. Also, can I just add a note to that? One of the mistakes in saying he, perhaps, one reason why not to, is because it instantly associates God with our mundane notions of power, doesn't it? Yes. Whereas power, yes. Whereas what we need is to transfigure. First of all, let me say, unlike a lot of postmodernist thinkers, I don't think power is at all purely negative. I think power is a thoroughly good thing. I can't get enough of it. It all depends on who has it, for what reasons, in what situation. The powerless don't think power's a bad thing. It tends to be the rulers or the liberal wing of the rulers who poo-poo the idea of power because they have quite enough of it themselves. Yes, power is an excellent thing if you're on the wrong end of it. You need to corner some for yourself. But nevertheless, we would surely only be in a better situation, not when we had got beyond power, but when we had transfigured the meaning of power out of recognition. Yes, I think that actually is part of what Marx is talking about when he talks about the state withering away. He doesn't actually mean there wouldn't be some political apparatus. He means it wouldn't be recognizable in the terms of class society. Yes, it wouldn't be a big, capital building. It would be a set of Soviets or self-governing communities or whatever you happen to believe. Yes. Power still, to be sure, but power otherwise. Democracy is not the negation of power. Democracy is a form of power, but rather a popular form of power.
Yes, I have a question. What
Could you
in
say,
the Bible?
where are you? Sorry.
Right
there
here.
you are.
Okay. I mean, in the Bible, Christ, spoke with authority. He said things that nobody would say today. Things like, before Abraham was, I am. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And so he came here to talk about the truth, and we're living in an age where the truth seems pretty obscure. So can you comment on that a little bit insofar as, why there seems to be a vacuum of leadership in the world today?
Well, I'm not sure I would equate the concept of truth with the concept of leadership. I'm very fond of the idea of truth, and I detest the idea of leadership. It always reminds me of some kind of tedious Boy Scout sort of cult. How many badges do you have? Leadership is a very American word, if I may say so. You hear it much more in the United States. People getting trophies for leadership and so on. I like to follow a long way behind. Also, we should, of course, I suppose, be a little cautious when we say Jesus said, shouldn't we? Are these really ipsissima verba? Are these really his words? Well, sometimes we don't know do we? He might have said something of the kind, but St. John makes him say all kinds of things that it's extremely unlikely he actually said, and so what? It's not meant to be some verbatim report, some journalistic documentation, just as, Roman authors may put into the mouths of famous characters whole speeches that they almost certainly never gave, but which may nonetheless capture the truth of what they did or said or were. Yes, one has to allow for a certain license here, I think. Yes.
I'm wondering if worship or liturgy is autotelic.
Autotelic. Yes, whether liturgy or worship is autotelic. Yes, that's an extremely interesting question, which is a cunning way of saying I don't know. You see, one might say the same about art. Okay, see, in one sense, worship is autotelic. There's no particular point in it. It doesn't get you any brownie points, It's an acknowledgement, a gratitude, In another sense, of course, liturgy makes sense within a larger context, doesn't it? If by autotelic you mean autonomous, I think no. I think it's not. I think I spent quite a long time making this mistake, that somehow the liturgy in my own writing was autonomous. But of course, the church exists for the sake of the world. Yes. And it doesn't exist for its own sake. And of course, when it has accomplished its end, it won't exist at all. There will be no temple in the New Jerusalem, just as for Marx the state will wither away, so the whole paraphernalia of religion, sacramental life and so on, will wither away. There will be no need for the sacraments in that situation, yes. The hymn that says, there's a hymn that wrongly thinks the sacraments are eternal. Is it the Tantum Ergo? Can't remember. Anyway, doesn't matter. Right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, there I am. This was really a good-for-nothing talk, though nothing good for us. So thanks for that.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes.
But I want to push you on something. Aside from learning from believers, from Christianity maybe, or from other believers, that it's good to have something that's good for nothing, what else can the atheist learn from the theist or from the believer?
What
can the atheist learn? Because you said earlier that atheists can learn from believers, and I would like to push you on that. What is it that the atheist can learn from the theist? What can he get out of the conversation?
Yes. To be quite honest, I don't remember saying that, but there are many things I've said I've either repressed, denied, disavowed, or merely forgotten. But nevertheless, I'm sure I did say something of the kind. Well, I think depends what kind of atheists one's talking about. There are lots of different atheists, but the atheists I have in mind, and that I have in mind in this remarkably attractive book of mine, The Reason, Faith and Revolution, people like my old left-wing comrade Christopher Hitchens, with whom I used to distribute leaflets outside the car factory in Oxford many years ago, where we were both part of the same socialist group. But Christopher grew up and matured. I was going to say sobered up, but that may not quite be appropriate, whereas I remain childishly fixated on my infantile behaviour. And I've almost entirely forgotten what I was going to say. Oh, yes. That kind of atheist, one of the things I think they could learn from Christianity is the sort of tragic view I was talking about. I say, one of the many things wrong with somebody like Dawkins, I think, is that he really doesn't take the point that some sort of self-dispossession is the condition of any achievement, to put it that way. On the contrary, he has an intolerably smug and complacent middle-class view of progress. And that's very interesting, isn't it? Because, you see, just at the point when postmodernism was supposed to have brought to an end such grand narratives as progress and Marxism and science, suddenly they were resurrected again. Why? Well, something that happened in the meanwhile was that 2 aircraft slammed into the World Trade Center. And suddenly, grand narratives were back on the agenda with a vengeance. It was suddenly no longer sufficient to get on with a certain kind of rather modest, mild, pragmatic postmodernism in the face of a new political enemy, post-Cold War, who was virulently metaphysical, you know. At that point, interestingly, at the very point when certain notions of progress and science and reason had been scornfully, disdainfully discarded by all right-thinking postmodernists, they were suddenly resurrected. And I think it has to do with, among other things, that return to a rather crude, sort of off-the-peg version of enlightenment had to do with the fact that the West had ideologically disarmed. It was no longer in a position to oppose this kind of enemy. Yes, it had beaten the Soviet enemy, you know, and was in a rather triumphalist spirit, which made it believe that history had ended, ideology had ended, metaphysics had ended. You know, that's all kind of post-Cold War stuff. The triumphalism of somebody who feels they've ridden over their enemy. Suddenly, that was exactly what they didn't need. And there was a sudden, I think, rather panic-stricken move back to certain ideas, certain rather callow ideas of progress and scientificity and so on. And I'm not, of course, everybody believes in progress with a small p, you know, even postmodernists have anesthetics when they go to the dentist, you know, I think, anyway. You know. But to revive all those rather, and I think Christianity has something to say about that, you know. Not anything to say against the idea, the reality of achievement, but it has something to say about the painful cost of achievement and the fragile nature of it. There's a kind, in other words, there's a kind of hubris in this rather smug middle-class progressivism, which is related, I think, to its atheism. Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more on the idea that evil is not, has no company, exists for some good. Because I seem to always believe that evil was always a way of achieving something else that is more good or creating a more profession.
Question is whether evil does exist for its own sake or exists for the sake of something else. Well, I mean, there are different theories of evil, aren't there, and different theologies of evil. I mean, it's just I think it's quite useful to differentiate evil in that respect from common or garden forms of badness, you know, self-interest and so on, because I think there is something rather enigmatic about evil. And I think one reason why people find it quite mysterious and therefore sort of spooky and lends itself to, you know, The Exorcist and The Omen and so on, is because things that seem to have no rationale are mysterious. Yes, we are creatures of reasons. Yeah, and there seems to be an odd suspense here. I think we have time for one more question, if there is. Yes, there's something at the back there.
Can you tell us something about your writing process and the balance between writing
And reading. Oh, I don't read anybody else, actually. I always feel that sort of intruding into their private space, you know. If I need to read a book, I just write one. I don't see any. Balance is far too kind and charitable a word for my somewhat dishevelled existence. I write as much as I do because I just enjoy writing enormously. If I didn't, I would stop. Yes. And I've tried all kinds of ways of stopping. You know, somebody suggested wearing boxing gloves, for example. You can't. I've looked for a contrascriptive of various kinds. You know, maybe there's some tablet you could take. And, you know, but now I've decided that there is an infallible way of stopping writing, but it's known as death, really. I don't know. I tend to go through bouts of writing and then bouts of reading. I don't really balance them out. I maybe do some research for a book for a few months, and then I write it in an embarrassingly short period of time. So much so that I have to conceal the fact from my publisher and pretend that I haven't finished it. In other words, my problems are the reverse of almost every other academic I've ever met, you see. But being of this kind, there's nobody I can talk to about it. It's like complaining that you're ravishingly handsome, or you have far too much money, and people just look sick and turn away.
It's true that you have absolutely no sympathy here on that score. But let us thank Professor Eagleton for it. I would like to invite you. There is a reception immediately outside, all waiting for you, and you can hopefully get a chance to talk to Professor Eagleton there. It's very helpful for us to have. This is very American, isn't it? To have cards for feedback, and finally to remind you that our next in the series of God and Culture for the Bannon Institute this year is the poet Christian Wyman from Yale Divinity School, who will be coming here on October 17th at 4 o'clock. Not here. It will be here. It will be here. So we hope to see you there, and thank you again for coming tonight. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.